Welcome to Unit 1, unit that focuses on the parts of speech. Many students are familiar with this concept. It's taught in elementary school and re-taught in most middle schools. But by the time you get to me as juniors, it's been a couple of years since you've studied any sort of grammar. A lot of you are starting to forget these concepts. The reason why that we start this sophisticated grammar course with something as simple as the parts of speech is because we're trying to change the way that you read sentences, moving away from just reading to determine the meaning of words and the meaning of what those words say, which is just generally how you're taught to read, to examining the function of those words and classifying them, really understanding how they work to build the sentence that you are reading. A comprehensive understanding of the parts of speech is critical to grasping all the grammatical concepts beyond this, so it's a good place to start. So, what are the parts of speech? It's a system of word classes based on how words function within a given grammatical unit, a phrase, a clause, or sentences. How those words make that thing what it is. Different linguists and different grammarians use different systems of classification. Some say that there are only 7 parts of speech. Others, however, believe there are as many as 10, and it just depends on how you want to classify this. Again, as I said in the last video, different linguists, different grammarians, we like to argue over what is actually the case. But again, you need to know what I teach in my lessons. We will study 8 parts of speech: noun, pronoun, verb, adjective, adverb, determiner, preposition, and conjunction. Let's start with this. This is kind of an interesting thing that students often don't consider. What are words anyway? We need to understand what the heck we are looking at before we start to classify those things. Words, simply put, are symbols created to represent reality. Words have no inherent value to themselves. They are purely arbitrary. It is the speakers of a language that gives them value, so they're mere symbols that speakers of a language create to represent the things in our realities. Words are the simplest grammatical unit, and we combine words to communicate more complex ideas. And in order to communicate more complex ideas, we require that we have different words to serve different purposes. The functions of words can be divided into 3 broad categories. We have substantives, which are all the concrete and abstract stuff that we perceive in our minds, which include nouns and pronouns. We have attributives, which are the abilities and properties attributed to the stuff that we perceive. The parts of speech that are attributives can include verbs, adjectives, and adverbs, and sometimes determiners, depending on how you look at it. The way that I teach it in my class, we're going to go ahead and call determiners attributives. And then lastly, the third category are syncategorematic words. These are words whose sole functions are to associate words to other words. They have no value by themselves. They're merely there to help you understand other words better. And that includes your prepositions and your conjunctions. What happened to the interjection? I bet a lot of you are wondering that. I have not mentioned the interjection yet. That's because interjections are a class of word, but they're not really a true part of speech. Here's what Sister Miriam Joseph has to say about interjections. They cannot be assimilated into the structure of a sentence and therefore have no grammatical import. That's true. Interjections have no real place in a sentence. They're purely extra. They're just extra stuff in a sentence. So since they don't serve a function, really, we don't study them as a part of speech. Yeah, they're just extra words, so we don't care about them. So why study the parts of speech? We've gone over this generally already, but I wanted to give you 2 very specific reasons why we study the parts of speech. One, to understand why good writing is good. Learning the parts of speech provides us with a foundation for syntactic analysis, which is the process of breaking a grammatical unit down into its most basic parts and examining how those parts interact. So taking a look at a dependent clause of some variety and breaking down, what the constituent parts are of that clause and how it's put together. Secondly, we study the parts of speech in order to apply the rules of English grammar to our own writing so that we write with proper grammar. English grammar does have rules, despite what I'm sure a lot of you think, what a lot of you have heard. There's just a lot of exceptions to the rules, but it does have rules. And these rules are based on how syntactic units function and on how these units are put together. So you need to understand the functions of words, phrases, and clauses in order to apply rules correctly. Here's an example of what I mean when I say studying what makes good sentences good. Take a look at this awesome sentence by Tim O'Brien. Listen to the rolling rhythm and movement of it. Here we go. In many ways, he was like America itself, big and strong, full of good intentions, a roll of fat jiggling at his belly, slow of foot but always plodding along, always there when you needed him, a believer in the virtues of simplicity and directness and hard labor. What a cool sentence. Now, that, by the way, is from Tim O'Brien's The Things They Carried, the novel he's most famous for. Now, how would you begin to write like this yourself? Because Tim O'Brien is a human being. Tim O'Brien went through high school, just like you were going through high school. So there's nothing preventing you from not writing awesome sentences like this as well. So how would you begin learning how to write like this? You do this by breaking down its structure and trying to imitate what he does in your own writing. Yeah. Once we've learned a lot of the parts of speech and a lot of the more sophisticated grammatical concepts that we're going to learn, we can see that this sentence begins with a prepositional phrase and a simple independent clause. He then has this long series of varying end modifiers, adjective phrases, absolute phrase thrown in there. There's a participial, and finally a positive phrase is the final end modifier. And it makes this sentence really cumulative, which, as we'll learn in a later lesson, is the modern style. And it also ends with unnecessary conjunctions in a 3-item coordinate series, something we call polysyndeton in rhetoric. But we don't know any of that unless we understand the basics of parts of speech. So once we are able to dissect this sentence into its parts, I can say, hey, I can write a sentence that begins with a prepositional phrase. I can write a sentence that continues with an independent clause, and so on and so forth. An example of what I mean when I say that studying the parts of speech is essential to using the rules properly. Here's what I mean by that. Oftentimes I get this. A student uses rules based on this right here. They've heard a teacher somewhere who's told them to use a comma wherever you would normally take a breath in a sentence. Well, this is absolutely incorrect and actually ridiculously childish. Hopefully no one past about the 3rd grade, as far as your teachers go, have told you to do this, because it's ridiculously simple and not true. For one thing, it's too open to individual interpretation. There is a right place and a wrong place to use a comma. We don't all breathe in the same place when we read. This is a rule that's used by people who don't understand grammar. So if you had a middle school teacher tell you this, you may want to send them an email. No, don't actually do that. I'm just kidding. Yeah. So what's actually correct is we can use commas with coordinating conjunctions to combine 2 or more independent clauses. You probably wouldn't want to do more than 2, but still you could. That's one rule for using a comma. However, to apply the rule, you'd need to know that clauses are built from a noun phrase and a verb phrase, and you need to know that independent clauses do not begin with relative pronouns or subordinating conjunctions. Also, since you need to combine them with coordinating conjunctions, you need to know what the 7 coordinating conjunctions are. So again, you see how unless you understand the 8 parts of speech and are able to identify words by those classifications, it's difficult to apply the actual rule of grammar, and you might end up applying a rather childish version of the real rule. Things to keep in mind when studying in this parts of speech. There are often multiple terms for the same thing, so keep that in mind. Write down all of the terms that I give you. Circle or box in, though, the term that I want you to use. It'll be pretty obvious which one that is. You may feel some deja vu as you go through this. Like I said, a lot of students have studied the parts of speech before, so it's likely not the first time you've studied this. However, don't let that convince you that you know it. Don't skim over concepts that you think you already know. There's a lot of memorization required in this first unit over parts of speech. There's a lot of memorization required when you learn anything. So some of this unit will be logical and intuitive, but keep in mind, some will require that you just plain memorize a concept or a list of words. There's not really much I can do about that.